always an interesting conversation when a farm is wanting to push dry matter, and I'm like, okay, well, we definitely want feed, but it's actually how that's going to respond to your purpose of farming, and you're farming the animal rather than the grass or the crop as such.
Welcome back to another episode of the Force of Nature podcast. Today's special guest is Melinda Turner from Farm Nutrient Advisory based in the Hawke's Bay of New Zealand. Melinda is an independent fertiliser and ruminant nutrition advisor, and she's probably the premier expert across New Zealand. She doesn't pull any punches when it comes to honestly talking about the state of New Zealand farming and where we can improve. So today's topic, we talk about soil and plant and how that connects to animal health and ultimately your farm profitability, plus a whole range of other topics that are really close to both of our hearts. So without further ado, let's get into it. How are you today, Melinda?
I'm good, thank you, Conan. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. It's great to have you on today. I'm very excited to have this discussion with you and delve into a few topics that are pretty close to my heart. Do you want to give the listeners a bit of a background on who you are?
Yeah, thank you for that, and thank you for inviting me on. I know we've spoken about it for a while now, so it's great to actually be here. But my business is Farm Nutrient Advisory Limited. Essentially, I am a self-employed, independent farm advisor. My area of expertise and specialty starts from independent fertilizer recommendations. But in terms of my purpose and my whole passion with what I do is actually connecting that to the plant and the animal health. So following that whole nutrient flow into the output of the farm and making sure that we minimize any inefficiencies and maximize production and profitability is the biggest key factor, keeping the environment and animal health as optimal as we can doing so.
Yeah, I'd definitely say you're an expert in the area. How did you fall into this realm of animal nutrition and connecting it to the soil?
Yeah, how long have we got? So, yeah, I mean, my first major in terms of uni was animal sciences. Animal science is certainly my biggest passion, but being Hawke's Bay based and in my final year, I very kind of quickly decided actually to tie all of that in and in a usable manner here is then being able to bring that into the agricultural space. So from there, I actually then did a new bachelor where at that time it was through Massey, and they allowed you to do a personal program where I kind of describe it as a pick a mix of topics rather than just a set generic degree. And so that allowed me more specifically to tie in that animal health, animal science, genetics to soil and plant sciences. So that was kind of my my initial sort of education base, where with that I worked in a number of labs, chemistry, medical, and horticultural, and fell into a sales rep role with the fertilizer industry, which I wasn't going to apply for because I don't like car salesmen, and I was always afraid of becoming a car salesman. And so with that role, I was always very, very aware that it was bigger picture. I wasn't sales driven. It was more what the client needed. And ultimately, that was my demise when I got made redundant while I was on maternity leave. So clearly didn't sell enough, or what I should have anyway. And that brought the opportunity where I had a number of my clients ask me to go out on my own and go independent, which what was never on my radar, to be honest. I didn't really know how to do that. But that was kind of the starting point, which was amazing, and had a I suppose, a ready-made client base to make that a little bit easier for me. And once I did go out on my own, it gave me the opportunity to actually sort of look at extending my education. And at that point, I started my master's in livestock health and production through the Royal Veterinary College in London. And that just, it was an incredible degree. And unfortunately, New Zealand doesn't have anything comparative where you can do a taught master's or a module-based master's that connects every realm of farming, essentially. So you're looking at starting at the ground level, the soil health, and how that connects from an environmental perspective and even a disease perspective, going forwards from a One Health approach, looking at human health at the end of it. You'd look at kind of what the animals are eating and how that affects their nutrition. It's a very nutritional based degree, which was what I wanted, because I wanted to go into ruminant nutrition afterwards, but be able to then connect that to what I was doing with kind of, that sort of fertilizer level, making sure everything we do has the purpose of improving animal health and improving production, not in terms of necessarily numbers of production, because that can be an inverse relationship, but in terms of improving production for your animal health, making sure that they're gaining weight quicker, and that higher feed conversion where essentially they go off farm earlier, they go off farm heavier, you've got better sort of repro rates and just overall better stock health, which directly impacts your profitability, rather than just pouring on fertilizer and hoping for the best, which quite often ends up in the waterways. So that was kind of how I ended up in following it through to a ruminant nutritionist role. And it just kind of escalated from there.
Well, it's certainly an interesting way of doing it, because I feel like you would be one of the only people in New Zealand that offer such a complete service from the soil through to the animal. And that's something that a lot of people don't actually make that connection, that what's happening with the soil was then transferred to the plant, and then that plant, that's the nutrition that the animal has, and that actually affects that long-term profitability, as you say. Are you finding that a lot of farmers are quite surprised when you're working with them, like the little tweaks that you're making?
Yeah, again, I think, and similarly, I suppose that's one of my biggest frustrations, where as far as I'm aware, I am the only one qualified, I suppose, if you like, in terms of that ground level and then the nutritionist level to give that complete picture. You've got a lot of even scientists, to be honest, where they've done a PhD in soil, and then they claim to know about animal health, when in fact it just hasn't actually been in their education. But again, you've got a lot of reps who like to say that they're looking at the complete picture, but really have very poor understanding on how each level impacts the other. So when I go to farm for the first time, and what I bring to the table is certainly unique, and a different perspective. I'm very lucky in the sense, I don't advertise for work, if you like. It's normally through either referral of another client, or rural professionals tend to refer me as well. So that's always nice, where the farmers already kind of know what they're, or kind of in the back of their mind know that it's going to be a little bit of a different conversation. And it's kind of that, the proactive mind, where the farmers know all along that there's something not quite right. There's a disconnect somewhere. What they hear, that just, they don't know what they don't know. But when we have that first discussion, it does typically tend to all fall in place and make perfect sense. Like if you've got too much potassium or too much nitrogen in kind of your pasture, for example, then consequently that's actually going to slow your growth rates down. And so it's a matter of either minimizing those impacts or trying to counteract it, whichever, and it alters depending on the cause of the issue. If the cause is putting nitrogen on and too much of it, then that's quite an easy fix. It's just getting them to understand that it's not going to reduce production. It's actually going to do the opposite and help you and that profit. So Yeah, it definitely is a different perspective. And I look at it from a very holistic point of view and quite a detailed approach from both ends. But yeah, most of the time, as I say, farmers, they're a switched on bunch where it makes perfect sense. They haven't really heard it before. And that comes from a very sales driven industry where, to be frank, there aren't many reps who, in their best interest, it's not necessarily to look at that whole picture either.
Yeah, and I always think that farmers are the expert on their land and they generally know when something's not right. I guess they go to their board of advisors that they use, and quite often they might not have the expertise, like you say, to solve what they're trying to solve. So coming in with those fresh ideas, I think is, well, I know personally that some of the farms that you work with, that I also work with, it seen drastic changes, and they're just so happy. Like, they're ecstatic with what they can see and the growth that they're seeing, and using like less fertilizer as well, which is they're all a bit surprised about, or just reallocating their normal fertilizer bill to something else.
Yeah, I think it's definitely, as I say, understanding what you're doing at ground level and how that impacts. And and crops are a prime example. Everyone's very much driven on crop yield. And for whatever reason, and to be frank, our industry promotes the yield being the important thing, when in fact, if you grow that yield with too much of a particular nutrient or nutrients that are beyond the metabolic capacity of a rumen, then that yield, half, like a good portion of that, is actually wasted energy for the animal to try and digest it. And so you're better off, even if it's not significant, it may only be a ton less per hectare, but you've got a higher feed conversion efficiency. The stock are actually growing on less, and that crop is able to be grazed for longer as well. And so it's all of those interactions that, from an agronomic level, just very, very poor understanding of. And our research is questionable, where it never actually looks at animal performance in terms of that holistic approach either. So there's a handful of agronomists and seed companies that I work with, which are very good, where they understand that bigger picture. They don't necessarily understand how it works, but they've seen it in action with kind of mutual clients, and they get the understanding that, yeah, the production and the crop yield isn't the all and sort of be all. It's actually about the animal production. And then you get other companies that just it's all about the yield and the nitrogen input and unnecessary inputs that actually cost them, the farmer, money. And I'll go as far as saying it's potentially an animal welfare issue if you're inducing subclinical acidosis because you're putting too much protein into them, when we know darn well that the animals can only take so much protein. So yeah, it's an interesting, always an interesting conversation when a farm is wanting to push dry matter, and I'm like, okay, well, we definitely want feed, but it's actually how that's going to respond to your purpose of farming, and you're farming the animal rather than the grass or the crop as such.
Yeah, it's farming for what you do want and focusing on that, rather than focusing on growing that total yield, and then hopefully the animal will do well on the backside of it.
Yeah, and it's all quite it's reasonably well predicted, because you can run your dietary analysis. It's always good to have specific figures on farm, but you can run it on a generic basis. We know a brassica isn't going to have a great dry matter. We know it's going to be sort of not particularly well balanced. And so you can actually give tangible figures to say, this is essentially what your stock are potentially going to do as it is. If we add a bit of straw, or if you've got a situation where you can add a little bit of grain, depending on the priority of the stock and whether it's just to get them through or whether they really want them to pump, we can predict all of that. And so that's what I do with, and a lot of what I'm doing at the moment is that predictive scenario. And then we kind of nurture that and tweak it depending on the actual results as they come through with the crops. But I think it's all definitely a matter of collaboration. And I'm never a big fan of kind of working in an isolated response where, as you say, a farm's got a whole team behind them. And if that team isn't actually willing to work within their realm of expertise, acknowledge there are areas that someone can maybe have a different input, and just work in a kind of harmonious, collaborative manner, like that makes a massive difference. And I have a couple of vets, a minority, but a couple of vets who are very much in that frame of mind where they acknowledge, look, nutrition isn't actually their job. They weren't trained in nutrition. They know the basics, but as far as actual nutritionists, they're not qualified. And so it's always really nice to work side by side if a farmer has an issue and say, okay, well, from a treatment point of view, that's obviously an expertise for them, but from a prevention point of view, that's where they look kind of at the bigger picture and understand, well, the farmer can save money, the animals can be healthier and better welfare if we treat the root cause. And that's quite often kind of, my purpose, I suppose.
That's awesome. So if we simplify it back down, how does like soil fertility translate to animal performance and health?
So, I mean, in terms of soil fertility, obviously we don't want it where it's limiting from a pasture or a crop growth perspective. But at the same time, we don't want it excess where what it grows is just too high in phosphorus is a prime candidate. Actually, a lot of our soils are pumped full of phosphorus because it's what our lovely sales reps tell people that they need to do, with no acknowledgement that if the phosphorus is not a limiting factor for the pasture, then the reality is the stock don't need as much. And the more you pump into them, the bigger imbalance you have with your calcium metabolism, your magnesium metabolism, and that all has a big knock-on effect with everything really, and even in terms of stock longevity. So if you've kind of got your breeding mob and that your sort of the hardiness of the teeth, the skeleton, like if you have high phosphorus and low calcium and or mag, that's going to actually mean essentially their skeleton isn't going to last as long as it could. And age, like dairy cows is a prime example. Age is obviously a big factor with increasing milk fever incidence, and it's because the bones get depleted of calcium as you get older. But the reality is a lot of our farms, dairy included, and even with calcium supplementation, quite often those stock are still not getting the amount of calcium required to offset incredible amounts of phosphorus going in. So the soil fertility has a major impact. And also, I mean, we want the soil health to be their soil structure. So again, I think typically our issue, we're very high driven with phosphorus and potassium either as well, both of which have really negative effects with the animal health when in excess, and that would be a majority of our higher producing farm systems. But then even from the soil perspective, if the calcium is low, then your water filtration, your structure, your nutrient availability, your microbiology, all of that is impacted, which will restrict a good balance of pasture uptake as well. And again, we underline our industry focuses on a pH of 5.8 to 6.2, or Hill's lab, who are Partners with Balance and ARL, who are obviously Ravensdown owned, they tend to say 5.8 to 6, which is reducing it even further. And that's just not actually where we need to be for maximum plant availability and maximum animal health. But secondly, the pH is really unreliable because it can be influenced and elevated by high potassium, sometimes magnesium. So you can have what appears to be an optimal pH in terms of our industry expectation, but be calcium deficient. And so there's a really poor understanding of the differences there. But if you looked at it from a pasture analysis, you can see that as well with the high iron and manganese uptake. That's in proportion to acidity, really. But again, we've got a big issue with our reporting from a lab standard. They give out bar charts. And a lot of those optimal ranges are questionable because they're dictated by the company and what they consider an optimal range, which is not necessarily what the research says, but it does support their motive with what they want to sell. But then most of what's bar charted is an average range. And that, again, is incredibly different to what a farm actually needs, because an average is just quite literally the bulk, the interquartile range of every result that lab gets from New Zealand, or if it's done on a regional basis. And that's really misleading itself. So if you look at pasture, on average, we have really high manganese and iron uptake because we're calcium deficient, but the range will tell you sort of anywhere between 70 and 250, when in fact you kind of want under 60. So it's very misleading, and what you do with the soil can rectify that to a degree. Economically, that's always different on a per farm basis, what they need, where they're placed, and landed costs, and then product costs come into it significantly at the moment. But it's a matter of obtaining what you can and getting an optimal soil health where if you want, or you've got the ability to do so, those other, I suppose, gaps at the animal health end, minerals are a big part of that. You can then rectify at the animal end to make sure that your output and your profitability isn't suffering.
Yeah, I think you've raised quite a few really poignant points in there, particularly around phosphorus. We see, let's think in a sheep and beef hill country sense, when the prices are high like they have been, and people are looking to cut their costs, so they're looking to bring down their fertiliser bills. But then you'll see something in the farming papers saying that if we don't use phosphorus, New Zealand will go broke, which is one of the most outrageous things I've seen in the newspaper. But there's such a focus on Olsen P in New Zealand, and it's been really driven home. What are the issues around that you see? Do you see that correlates to what's actually happening in the soil or in the plant?
Oh, so Olsen P is a really it's a very old test going back to the 50s, but the issue with it is its methodology has no applicability to what we farm in New Zealand, or our soil type. So the Olsen P, and I mean by definition, and what you'll learn in university, is that it's the plant available portion of your soil phosphorus. Now, the definition should be tweaked when it comes to an Olsen P, because anything that measures your plant available portion, whether it's an Olsen P, a Bray, an M3, or an EDTA, they're only actually looking at a very, very small part of that. So first of all, whatever number you get, regardless of what test you get, is not all there is. So it's not a big picture. Secondly, the Olsen P specifically is tested at a pH of 8.5 in the lab. So any soil sample that's sent in, the lab will change that solution to a pH of 8.5, and then it will read how much plant available phosphorus you have in that sample and in that soil. So the issues we have is a pH of 8.5 is very basic. It's very alkaline compared to what we have in quite an acidic soil. So even a pH of 6, I mean, that's not near neutral. That is definitively acidic. So the way chemistry behaves between an acidic and an alkaline solution is very different. So that's the key with the SMP, is that it is only really a reasonable predictor of plant availability if your soil is alkaline. And by alkaline, we're talking about pH of 8.5. And that's what was happening in North America when the SMP was developed, was that they've got a lot of soils where in a high alkaline condition, any phosphorus there is quite often locked up by calcium. We don't have that issue. In an acidic soil, most people are aware, whether they implement it on farm or not, but most people are aware phosphorus gets locked up by your iron, your aluminium, your manganese, and essentially it forms oxides in the soil that are unable to be extracted by the plant. Now, calcium is needed to reduce those elements from forming compounds with the phosphorus. So we need calcium to unlock the phosphorus, and not how it occurs in an alkaline. So that's the biggest issue with the SMP, is that if we've got calcium in our soil, or if you have limed your soil, or if you use RPR, for example, a calcium-based fertilizer, any calcium in your soil sample, when the lab tests the SMP, will take away that phosphorus, and it will basically say it's not able to be released to the plant. But at your pH, it's the complete opposite. Obviously, any calcium in your soil helps us release that phosphorus. But what the SMP doesn't measure is all of those other elements we have an issue with, your iron, your aluminium, and your manganese. So in the same breath, your SMP can overestimate what you've got, or it can underestimate what you've got. And then the other issue with the SMP relative to other methods is that it's a volumetric measure. So it's done in solution. And again, that then can change significantly how you interpret an SMP. So if you've got a low volume weight or bulk density, like a kind of volcanic sort of soil, the SMP will significantly underread what you've got compared to a gravimetric measure and a quantity in a particular solid. So it's a really can be a very, very misleading test. I don't pay any attention to it whatsoever. The research behind it, the decent research done on it, actually concluded that it is not a good predictor of production. And the reason why they concluded that is because in all of their trials, I think there was 19. I've got the graphs I quite often present to people, but in all of those, there was a very, very poor correlation between your SMP and your maximum production. So often in different soil types they looked at, there was often an SMP under 10 or even 5 where they were reaching their maximum yield, despite that SMP being what your co-ops would typically say deficient. So I would normally promote in New Zealand, for example, I use the resin P as the SMP alternative. The resin P doesn't change your pH, so it's a lot more robust with what occurs on your farm. And then in Australia, it's the DGTP, which is the equivalent. So very similar method where it doesn't change the pH of your soil, and so it's again more robust with determining, okay, well, what lockup do you have on your farm? But all of those, regardless of methodology, they still only look at that small portion of what's available kind of then and there, and that can change reasonably rapidly if you may have had an absolutely crack a couple of weeks of growth, and then what was plant available has been extracted quite quickly, and the organic matter hasn't quite caught up. So you can get a bit of variation that doesn't necessarily correlate with what you would expect in terms of management or input with those inorganic methods. So the total P is what I always tend to look at, together with the resin P, which I explain as kind of the fuel in the tank. So it looks at everything, including a portion that is kind of your humus that's inert. It will never become plant available, but it's there as a baseline. You've got a big portion of organic that has potential to become inorganic. And then within that, you also kind of have that in between your organic and your inorganic plant available. You've got kind of that low bowl P. So your total P looks at everything as a whole, and that's a much better indicator of your long-term opportunities or potential. And quite often that's really high because we've got farms that have just put religiously superphosphate on year after year, but they've got really poor calcium soils, so that phosphorus is just locked up. It's built up the total P, but they've got kind of bugger all plant available P. And in those situations, there's just no benefit at all continuing to put phosphorus on because your plants aren't utilizing it as they should. And secondly, you don't want massive amounts of phosphorus in your soil for either environmental or your actual animal health perspective. So understanding how tests are tested in the laboratory and how that impacts and relates to what goes on your farm, and then taking it a step further of how that then relates to your actual animal health is a massive one, and the LSMP just doesn't meet the mark.
That's absolutely fascinating. I think that's a pretty good explanation about phosphorus in New Zealand. I think a few people would learn quite a lot from that. You spoke about calcium in there. Is that one of the more important elements that farmers should be more aware of rather than looking at their P levels?
Yeah, definitely. I think calcium is just completely underrated here in New Zealand. And to be fair, I'd say with the work I do across the Tasman, like it's similar there as well. We've all got different soil types, but the reality is the chemistry doesn't change in how you interpret that. So the calcium level is a massive key to unlock any farm potential in my mind. There are a few areas, especially like alluvial floodplains or like in Hawke's Bay here where I'm based. We've obviously post-cyclone, we've got a lot of new ground on top of the actual soil, which is very high pH. So those areas that are genuinely high calcium are in the minority, but they're a different kettle of fish. For the bulk of our farms, and sort of your hill country or your flat country, calcium is underdone by miles because it's an insoluble product. I never recommend you throw 2, 3, 4 ton to the hectare on because you need it to be little and often, so you're getting it to actually dribble through the soil profile and improving it as a whole, not just improving the pH on top, which on an average improves the pH but doesn't actually do anything for your soil profile deeper down. But the calcium base saturation, again, in the soil tests really aren't promoted. And you've got a lot of theories out there. I suppose Albrecht would be the sort of the most known one, where they concentrate on base saturations. It is not an Albrecht theory. It is very basic chemistry to understand how elements antagonize one another. I don't follow any particular set percentage in terms of the calcium. Every farm is different, and you've got to understand that. You can't, with Albrecht in America, they've decided a 68% calcium base saturation is the sweet spot, and everyone in the entire world needs to apply to that. I disagree. First of all, I think that's actually too low from an animal health point of view when you look at the pasture and you look at the diet as a total. But secondly, yeah, again, it's got to be economic. So you've got some steep country, you've got high country. Reality is achieving 68% is probably not going to be economical, but achieving above 60 is likely to be. And that in itself will be a big difference to what is quite often 30%, even 20%. And that is a massive impact on the actual farm health and animal health. Yeah, I think liming, I've got a lot of high country farms. I've got a lot of East Coast farms where we are miles away from a lime quarry. But the reality is getting lime on that farm, regardless of how far you're pulling it and the flying cost of it, that far outweighs any benefit you're going to have by just continuously doing superphosphate. And so that's the biggest argument. A lot of farmers who've been under a cooperative rep will, or any FERT rep will have, is that they get told it's too expensive to do lime, because you look at the lime price, which we know is cheap on a per tonne basis. You look at the landed costs, which are proportionally a lot higher, as they would be, and then they decide it's too expensive, but with no understanding on how important calcium actually is to their entire farm system. At the moment, even if you're pulling lime 4 or 5 hours away, getting it landed is cheaper than fertilizer equivalent. But secondly, going back to that phosphorus in the soil, absolutely no point continuing to put phosphorus on if it's locked up. So so you need to utilize what you're doing, and again, remember you're farming the animal. And that's what we lose sight of for the most part, I think, is that the animal is our output and we need to do best by what they need. And that should be then driving what we do in terms of a fertilizer regime, as well as obviously then actually promoting good soil structure and getting that as resilient as it possibly can be, where it looks after itself, it sustains itself, and what we put into it is just a top up on what we need to maintain the target production levels.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. Do you think that's the biggest misconception around ruminant nutrition in New Zealand?
Yeah, definitely one of them. Yeah, I think calcium, the actual quantity, if you look at it in isolation, and this is where we get caught out all the time, is we look at whether it's soil or plant or animal level, we look at a nutrient in isolation. And again, that is not how chemistry or biochemistry behaves. It needs to be looked at relative to all the other elements that interact. So from a quantity perspective, stock don't need a huge amount in terms of calcium. They do need double what they do with phosphorus, but the actual quantity is quite small. The issue we have is that pasture and pasture only, especially in some of our soil types, is not a balanced diet. And mineral wise, it really can be very, very imbalanced. So you've got, again, your high phosphorus potentially, you've got your high potassium, and that can impact on that calcium availability in the animal quite significantly. So from that point of view, again, at all levels, soil, plant, and animal health, I think calcium is underrated. But the other, I suppose, the biggest misconception, in my opinion, is how farmers get told that pasture is the best kind of most balanced and efficient form of feed. Again, from a new ruminant perspective, that's actually not correct, because quite often our pasture is so imbalanced, and not necessarily driven by fertilizer inputs. It can be seasonal. But if we take a high producing farm where you're pouring on nitrogen, you're pouring on phosphorus, you're pouring on potassium, a lot of the time with no justification, if you actually understand what the soil test results and pasture analysis is telling you, but that all then leads to even bigger imbalance. And the animals, when they're dealing with those imbalances, and protein is a prime example, and this can be either nitrogen driven from a fertilizer, and or seasonal. Quite often our spring or autumn pastures are really high in protein relative to what the stock need. When you get a protein, for every protein percentage above what is kind of the maximum for that particular stock class, it reduces the effective ME by nearly 0.2. And that's because having too much protein or nitrogen in the rumen is an energy expensive process for that to then be sent to the liver to be processed and excreted as a way to detoxify essentially what is too much potent feed going in. And that is quite often what our pasture does. And crops again are another prime example where it is too potent for what you are trying to achieve. Even dairy cows do not need that much crude protein. So having a fiber like a straw even available, just one, helps dilute that protein, and secondly, actually gets the rumen to ruminate. So that's the other. I suppose there's lots of big misconceptions, and the other one would be that we get told that dairy, or sort of Dairy NZ, are very big promoters of this, but they will tell us that the fiber in your grass is enough. That's a whole lot of crap, quite literally, because the really highly degradable fibers in our pasture, they're not the type of fiber the rumen needs to actually function as a rumen. So for that, you need really rough, scratchy type of fiber that forms a mat and just gives surface area for the microbes to work on, slows everything down, allows the microbes to actually produce the energy components in a balanced fashion, which then improves overall feed efficiency and digestion. You cannot get that from a lush, fast-growing pasture, especially one driven by nitrogen. And so, again, with all my clients, they get nagged on a reasonably frequent basis to make sure that we've got the fiber, ideally in the paddock as ad lib. And it doesn't necessarily, depending on the total diet, because that's always a big thing, is you've got to look at the total diet, not just one component. But quite often just a low grade fiber, whether it's kind of average hay or quite often straw, I promote for that dilution perspective where we have too much. We actually want it to dilute total nutrient density. And yeah, having that available with the crop or the paddock or in before and after the milking shed. And that will really help your rumination rates, which then lower the incidence of, I refer to it as subclinical acidosis. The reality is, in my opinion, these animals can be having a mild SARA without really meeting what the vet textbook would say is a subclinical acidosis. But in terms of lack of rumination, acidosis, it is not solely driven by carbohydrates. And quite often in our industry, it is not carbohydrates that drive it. It is lack of fiber and high protein. So yeah, getting that balance and again, understanding true nutrition is a massive factor in optimal farming.
Yeah, and I think it pairs quite nicely with what we've talked about this before in the past around grazing management in New Zealand isn't as good as everyone thinks it is. And I know Pablo Gregorini thinks we're outside of the top 10 of grazers in New Zealand, in the world now, which most industry groups will say we're still the best.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what you see, what some people are doing overseas is
he's actually doing a trial on a farm I work with, but I haven't met him in person yet. But he's talking at the New Zealand Association of Ruminant Nutritionists next month, so that'll be interesting. And yeah, I totally agree. I think that we have a very poor understanding on what residuals should really be, and I mean, sheep bring a difficulty, I suppose, with grazing management. And I know a lot of farmers who just like to have things grazed low, whereas again, from a nutritional standpoint, if you don't have sufficient residuals, which are a lot higher than we tend to think they are, like in the UK and in Wales, for example, they kind of promote your 6 centimeters, which you'll be pushed to find that on many of our farms, to be honest.
Yep.
So in terms of kind of that grazing residual, and so going into winter is a prime example where if you don't have good pasture covers, those stock have to work a heck of a lot harder to find their daily dry matter intake. And then what happens is a bit of a knock-on effect, because the more they have to search for that food, the more energy they burn. And this is coming into lambing, where they're already, in terms of their energy levels and their demands and the supplies, as big as it's kind of going to get in terms of a deficit. So the more we can do to minimize their energy expenditure to find what they need is going to pay dividends. And that comes down to pasture management as well. Again, seasonal variations can throw everything under the bus anyway, if you have kind of an autumn drought and things like that. But again, then it's a matter of, okay, well, supplementary feed. South Island farms do a fantastic job of supplementing their stock through winter. I mean, obviously that's driven by the fact that their winters are harsher, but in terms of an animal nutrition and requirement point of view, we quite often up in the North Island need to kind of look at that as well. But again, we've got our industry organisations that are discouraging, I suppose, farmers from supplementary feed, because if you buy an import feed, then that's an extra cost, and then they claim that you're inefficient, when in fact the reality is, if you're not feeding your stock as well as they should be, then that's the inefficiency, not whether you bring in feed or not. So again, every farm is incredibly different. But yeah, and again, like we had a last year we had a Australian veterinary nutritionist come in and talk to us, which I really enjoyed, as he just outright told everyone in the room, like, New Zealand is not farming well. And everyone just gasped. And I kind of almost had to quieten my giggle, because it is just so many people get really called out with the fact that no, we're not actually as good as our industry is telling us we are now. We have massive potential to be that again. But the reality is, continually getting told to pat ourselves on the back, we don't need to meet regulations, or we don't need extra regulations because we're already farming efficiently. It's crap. I'm allowed to say that?
You absolutely are. You've just hit it nail on the head. It's the conversation that everyone is tiptoeing around, and I think a lot of people do realise that that's probably the case, but we don't want to have the conversations around how we can change and improve things. And it just blows my mind. Like, aren't we trying to get better and facilitate that, number 8 wide mentality that we used to have?
Yeah, well, I think the issue is, and I don't know if you've come up against it just yet, but there's a few of us obviously that are more, I suppose, outspoken and just brutally honest than others. The Kiwi way isn't really to have an honest conversation. They don't like it. So
No.
that's like, so that's the issue. But then when you actually tackle these companies, and there's obviously a good few companies that are the causes of all of this, and I would say kind of, well, even if you read the paperwork that Beef and Lamb have put out between calcium, they're saying that you can almost farm, like, don't worry about lime unless you're under 5.2. I mean, that's just absolute ridiculous. Has got no basis behind it. Yet this is what they're promoting farmers, and farmers look to them for advice. And then you've got sort of, I mean, dairy NZ, again, really questionable in terms of that holistic approach, and very pro nitrogen driven grasses, which again, from a environmental point of view, an animal health point of view, a global consumer point of view, is really digging us a bigger hole than we're already already in, and they're kind of just like the ostriches with their head underground, I think. But having the conversations with them, Fonterra, Balance, like, they don't like you saying that out loud, and you will get backlash from it, and that puts a lot of people off. I'm self-employed, so I'm not going to sack myself. So whereas a lot of people who are in employment, and even within those companies, they can't say the truth because they'll lose their job as a consequence. And you've got such a high level of infiltration of essentially corruption and massive conflict of interest, even to government level. I mean, you look at what the government is doing, like, it's just, again, you could question, okay, well, those farmers on the government, I would say, why, they're probably not the best of the farmers in terms of that holistic approach and actual intricate understanding of what the hell they're doing, and sort of those areas of opportunity for them. And I mean, previously we had obviously the government give Balance a ridiculous amount of money. I think it was $10 million or something for sustainable research. And it's like, why the hell would you do that to a fertilizer company? Sustainable research for who? Because their sustainability is not the same as an individual farmer's sustainability. And yeah, again, you could bring in the whole definition of cooperative. I personally think if New Zealand had a better legal system, the farmers as a collective group for numerous actions could absolutely take these cooperatives to the High Court and win. But unfortunately, our legal system is as poked as our agricultural industry, I think.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think I've found that I get painted as a regen guy as a way of kind of diminishing, so the conventional people stay away from me. It was what I've found more recently. But it's funny because pretty much everyone I work with is all conventional guys. Like, I don't work with the conventional guys who are way down the track. It's just their way of dismissing me.
Yeah, all of my, I've got a couple of organics, but the majority of my client base are as conventional as they get. I'm not a fan of the fashion word regenerative, because for the conventional guys, and the reality is those improvements that we can have, the biggest impact would be with your traditional farmers, rather than those who are absolutely fine to go their own way and farm in a completely different natural manner. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But those guys are already making those changes, but they're the minority. And so we need to have the bulk of our farmers understand that they don't need to be farming under the fashion word regenerative to be good farmers. They have the potential to be the best in the world again if they just do these basics, conventional farming basics well, and grazing management comes into that. But I think, that nutrition is just a big area of opportunity in New Zealand. We don't do it well. We don't have a lot of people who understand it well. We certainly don't have many people, even from a nutritionist point of view, who then have the ground level, quite literally, where it's all kind of put together. So yeah, and I mean, our methane, for example, you've got all of these companies trying to make good money out of selling you supplements to reduce methane. It's just like, if you just fed the damn animals the way they should be fed, that actually reduces methane. So rather than trying to encourage our farmers to spend more money to supplement with seaweed or whatever they want to use to reduce methane, if they just actually gave the stock a bit of fibre to ruminate in those times where we don't have enough fibre, lo and behold, that's actually going to reduce your methane as well. I think methane's barking up the wrong tree completely anyway, to ignore the fact that we've got nitrous oxides and planes flying around the world and Chinese factories.
Yeah.
That's an argument.
You're spot on though. But isn't it crazy though that is a solution for methane, is actually just feeding them nutritionally well, rather than actually all this tech
I
stuff that they're
know.
spending millions
Like,
of dollars on at the moment.
well, I never. If you feed something, it all improves the farts and the burps.
Yeah. A real interesting thing around the nutrition side for the human, they did it, Dan Kittredge in the US did a whole lot of trials on what the farming land use, like whether it was organic, regenerative, no-till, and he basically said there was no difference between the farming type. It all came down to how they managed the soil. So some of the conventional guys had some of the most nutritionally best food that they were selling, and some of the regen guys were down the bottom. Like, it all comes down to how you manage that soil and that nutrition, like you're doing. So
definitely that it's just that massive flow-on effect, and I think I've brought it up before on LinkedIn a little while ago, but I think a massive potential we have is with our meat quality actually being QC'd for nutrient density from a human perspective. And so again, looking at kind of that One Health approach where it's that soil, the plant, and the animal, and then the actual end user, which is us, to focus on that again. And I mean, we've got obviously we've got companies that work on kind of your flavors and your omegas and things like that, but no one actually looks at your trace element composition, for example. And the same, so this could be an argument for vegetable growers, because they don't have any productive gain benefit to putting selenium in the soil, for example, because it's not going to help their production, but it sure as heck would help the end user. And if you were to, and again, we should have on everything we eat, we should have an average or a QC batch of nutrient and mineral analysis where you can actually see, okay, well, that's incredibly deficient. Because I myself, like, I know with the stock I work with, I'm like copper's an interesting one, because it's easier said than done to necessarily get a good effect with copper depending on your regime. But selenium, even though everyone is aware of selenium, quite often isn't in the levels we need. And iodine is completely forgotten about, because as a whole, our vet industry seems to believe you don't need iodine unless your sheep have goiter. And the research in Australia has absolutely blown that out of the water, where they've shown production-wise, and not just mortality, but actual growth and overall health and profitability of farm systems without iodine supplementation is significantly lower than if you supplement with iodine. But again, that all then goes to the end user, with whether it's a meat product or a vegetable product. If these aren't getting the minerals that we require and our soils are deficient in them, again, you've got anything that if you've got high protein or high nitrogen input, that reduces copper, things like that. That all works negatively for the end user. And so I've got like a concoction of, I take selenium, I take iodine, because I'm like, well, I know our food doesn't have it in it, and if it's not in the food, then you're going to have to take it directly. And I thought I was a bit of a hypocrite if I tell everyone to jab their stock with iodine or supplement with selenium if I then ignore it from my end as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the biggest opportunity for red meat producers in New Zealand going forward, is that nutritional density.
Yeah.
But if we're not able to produce that, which I don't think people realise the quality of our meat isn't as good as what we think it is, we actually won't capture any of those premiums, especially with like this big health craze that's growing at the moment.
Or even in terms of like, there's not really anything out there from an incentive point of view for that. So while, I mean, I would heavily argue for anyone, like, the reality is your zinc, your copper, your selenium, your iodine, they will benefit directly from a profitability perspective if their stock has a regime set up to make sure that they've got sufficient levels. And by sufficient levels, I mean in the upper range that they get from the lab reports, not the lower range. But like beyond that, there is no incentive to have that in the meat from a premium perspective. And I think if we had anyone bring in that line where they did a kind of a QC batch for everyone, sending something off, and they graded it according to that nutrient density and the mineral analysis, that would just change the perspective entirely, both for the good of the animal health, but then also the human health.
That's awesome. So if we've talked about nutrition a lot today, how do we, as farmers listening to this, improve the advice or understand how we can get better advice around our nutrition so we can have more healthy animals that are producing better?
The tricky thing is, I suppose, is again with our industry and our generic degrees that don't really train our professionals in particular areas that other countries see relevant. There's not a huge amount of advice out there. So a lot of it would be just due diligence, I suppose, and understanding that the rumen, it needs protein, but the reality is we tend to meet our protein levels pretty darn easily, if not exceed them. So fiber and kind of those longer pastures aren't a bad thing at all. And yeah, those mineral balances, again, you can get, we have experienced it. We've got I suppose I refer to them as a monopoly. We've got a particular vet club in Hawke's Bay where the majority of farmers aren't happy with them. And I've got farmers who we have been asking for them to test iodine on the bloods. We've got one farmer who's gone back and said that his first record of asking for it is 5 years ago, and they just outright refuse. And then finally we've gotten those bloods and they're incredibly low, which is not like unsurprising, but he's been battling with just not getting the health and production he's wanted, and that's always been in my eyes a big key to it. So we've got a lot of vets that battle with farmers if they request to have a look at your iodine and your other trace elements. Secondly, you got to know what you're looking for. So there's no point testing your copper in your blood. That's only going to tell you when you've nearly got a dead cow, because the liver keeps that blood primed. So it's the liver you need to look at. So don't test the copper in the blood. But your iodine, selenium, copper, B12, zinc, blood slivers, any farmer should really have those done on a regular-ish basis, even to at least get a baseline. Pre-winters are vital to understand that you've got those levels in the upper half of that range to know you've got a good buffer going through winter when they're going to be used up more readily. But it's hard because, as I say, this particular company in Hawke's Bay will actually refuse, and that's just again, it's not for the farmer benefit. So you've got to be prepared to kind of stand your ground, which not everyone really wants to have that conflict, which is unfortunate that some people are put into that predicament. So just knowing your stock, getting those bloods and livers done in times of really high growth, if you've got the means to do it, make sure that they've got enough fiber for that rumination. But it is very difficult to get advice in our industry just because of how sales driven we are, and that unfortunately isn't going to change anytime soon until the government changes the regulations and conflict of interest and kind of having that top down approach.
Yeah, I agree. It's extremely frustrating that they're there to service the farmer, but they're not doing that. They're actually putting their own expertise over it and saying you don't need it, which is not true. So if the listeners are looking to connect with you, what's the best way to follow along with what you do and get in touch if they need to?
So I don't have a website. I'm not that high tech, but you can follow me on Facebook, Farm Nutrient Advisory Limited, or I am a little bit active on LinkedIn. So if you just look up Melinda Turner, A hint of sarcasm there. Or Melinda at farmnutrients.co.nz if anyone just had any specific inquiries or questions.
Yeah, you definitely have some of the best LinkedIn posts I've seen. So it's a great follow, and also enjoyable watching people comment below and see what they have to say about what you're doing.
See how many friends I make that day.
Yeah. So I generally wrap up my podcast with 4 quickfire questions at the end. The first one is, what's the one thing that you would change about the agricultural industry?
I think it would be, that kind of corruption production line that we're on, and reducing the conflict of interest, because I think that is really the key to unlocking the ability of independent and more wide scale kind of advice.
And I think that's how we get back to being the best, is taking out that conflict, especially around the science.
Yeah.
If we look back at your younger self, what's one piece of advice you'd give?
Probably just enjoy kind of the journey and what life throws at you. Sometimes easier said than done as things occur, but and not actually be afraid to be that black sheep and be in the minority. It's not necessarily or always a bad thing.
Absolutely not. And what's something that's exciting you at the moment?
On a work level, I guess the prospect of potentially being a small part of a bigger change.
Mm-hmm.
On a personal level, I really enjoy and look forward to watching my oldest son play football, and he's a little bit good, so it's really nice to see him play and how he evolves.
That's awesome. Those are both very cool things. And finally, what's the force of nature to you?
This is another on a personal level. My other son is a force of nature. My youngest, he is definitely a sprightly little individual who keeps us on our toes, and definitely keeps me thinking. I've got to be very, very savvy with communicating with him to negotiate and compromise while parenting.
That's awesome. I'd probably class you as a force of nature as well. I love watching your journey and your confidence that you speak with, and the honesty about what's happening in here. It's inspiring. And I know that a lot of other people are definitely watching and getting a bit of confidence to go their own way as well.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you very much.
No worries. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Melinda. It's been a fantastic conversation. I think we've covered some really, really good topics and got some good explanations around things. So thank you very much for your time.
No, thank you very much for having me.